Good evening. Come on in and find a seat. My name is Tobias Winwright. I'm a professor of moral theology here at St. Patrick's Pontifical University. Our interim president, Reverend Dr. Michael Shortall, is unable to join us in person today and sends us his sincerest apologies. So on his behalf and on behalf of both St. Patrick's Pontifical University and Trócaire, I would like to welcome you to this evening's lecture. I would like to welcome all of you, those who are present in person, as well as those who are online via Zoom, to the annual Trócaire lecture. Before I hand things over to Gwen Dempsey, who is head of Trócaire's Ireland division, I would like to say a few words about St. Patrick's in Maynooth and about Trócaire. St. Patrick's College Maynooth opened its doors as an educational institution in 1795 as a national seminary, becoming a pontifical university in 1896. In the intervening 2 centuries, it has established an impressive reputation for scholarship and learning. Today, as a pontifical university, we specialize in the study of theology and philosophy and related areas in one of the most beautiful campuses in all of Ireland, which we share with Maynooth University, the National University of Ireland in Maynooth. As for Trócaire, it is the overseas development agency of the Catholic Church in Ireland. The pastoral letter which marked its founding in 1973 spells out Trócaire's dual mandate. Quote, "The aim of Trócaire will be twofold. Abroad, it will give whatever help lies within its resources to the areas of greatest need among the developing countries. At home, it will try to make us all more aware of the needs of these countries and of our duties towards them. These duties are no longer a matter of charity, but of simple justice." End of quote. The word Trócaire means mercy or compassion in the Irish language. Trócaire works in over 20 countries around the world to defend human rights, to achieve climate and environmental justice, to ensure women's and girls' protection, voice, and influence, to save lives and protect human dignity, to mobilize the public to achieve global justice for each and every person. In 2023, Trócaire celebrated its 50th anniversary, and this was an opportunity to renew its vision for a just world. Trócaire's links to the Irish Episcopal Conference traversed those 50 years and continue to be a valued relationship. The support of the Irish Episcopal Conference is greatly valued by Trócaire. Members of the Irish Episcopal Conference are in attendance this evening, and I welcome them and you all again to this prestigious lecture. Now Gwen Dempsey will introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. First, I just want some housekeeping, just to let you know we are recording the lecture, so anybody online, just be aware of that. There also will be time for a question and answer at the end, so I encourage you to take some notes during it for any questions you may have, and those of you who are online, please put them into the Q&A. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Anna Rowlands. Professor Rowlands is a lecturer in contemporary Catholic theology and Deputy Director of the Centre of Catholic Studies at Durham University. She is the holder of the St. Hilda Chair in Catholic Social Thought and Practice. Dr. Rowlands is a political theologian who works at the interface of political and social theory and Christian theology. Her original training was in social and political sciences, followed by postgrad degrees in theology. Professor Rowlands has a particular interest in multi-contextual research and is the founding chair of an innovative practitioner academic centre for Catholic social thought and practice, and works closely with a number of leading faith-based organisations, including Citizens UK, CAFOD, and the Caritas Social Action Network. Dr. Rowlands' key research interests include theological ethics, asylum and migration, and the political theology of the common good. Professor Rowlands' key publications include Towards the Politics of Communion, Catholic Social Teaching in Dark Times, and the T. Clarke Reader in Political Theology, and the Oxford Handbook of Religion and Contemporary Migration. The theme of Professor Rowlands' input tonight is A Politics of Hope and Catholic Social Teaching as a Guiding Light, and will focus on how in this Jubilee Year of Hope and the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si might inspire a politics of hope in light of Catholic social teaching. Please welcome Professor Anne Rowlands.
Thank you, Gwen, and thank you, Jane, in particular, who's standing at the back, who has done so much to organise this evening. So just to sort of say thank you in particular to her and to all of the team at Trócaire for inviting me to give this lecture this evening, and to you for giving up your evening, whether you're online or here in person. The theme for this evening is a theology of hope and a politics of hope. These could not be, I think, more timely themes. A month ago, the new US Vice President, J.D. Vance, achieved what most theologians fail to do in a lifetime, to make Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine headline news. Following an interview on Fox News, an extended online spat with the British political commentator Rory Stewart, he launched his version of the patristic medieval Christian order of love into the febrile media stratosphere. His case was that placing the love of family and nation first, and only having loving obligations to others beyond kin and neighbourhood and nation, if there is moral and material resource left when this duty is completed, is not only a natural instinct, but also core Christian teaching. Vance presents this as the political theology of Make America Great Again, coinciding with the announcement of huge cuts to the US international aid budget, a move with global ramifications, and alongside severe criticism of the motivations of the US Catholic Church for its migrant support work. In this context, the withdrawal from current forms of international humanitarianism is presented as an ordered Christian virtue. This marks, I think, a significant shift in how Catholics in public office talk about local and international social justice commitments. It is also, I think, diametrically opposed to the vision of universal siblinghood or fraternity and social friendship that both Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti have promoted as the very basis of a politics of hope. In fact, it is arguably a case study in the very diagnosis that Fratelli Tutti offers of a disintegrating politics turned in on itself, promoting a notion of competing, even as Pope Francis calls it, narcissistic localisms, which fail to see the interrelationship, the profound interconnection and co-belonging of the local and the universal. Let us be clear that this is a global phenomena, not solely an American one. Christian social justice work has become gradually more politicized over the last decade. Caritas Internationalis, the Jesuit Refugee Service, amongst others, can testify to this. The works of mercy, the commitment to the structural work for justice, humanitarian relief and development work are increasingly both politicised and weaponised as part of a wider cultural, economic and political set of conflicts. I say this so starkly at the outset for several reasons. First, it highlights that when we talk this evening about Christian visions for social living, we are addressing ideas already in circulation and argued about in our political life. Christian visions are already active, present, contested, even if not always in a very well-informed way. Secondly, any account we give of Christian hope needs to be able to communicate itself clearly and with conviction in this increasingly fraught context. We cannot afford to be naive about the political deployment of our faith, nor risk countering it with cheap hope. We live in a moment when the choice is not to have a political theology or not, but between rival political theologies whose accounts of love, of hope, and of justice differ widely and sometimes violently. 30 years ago, the secularization thesis taught us that religion was heading towards museum status in the West. That thesis has not aged well. For while formal institutional religious disaffiliation continues in the global North, the political significance of religion rises, and new forms of religious and post-religious practice emerge in both the global North and South. Religious communities also remain amongst the most significant humanitarian providers globally, localizing aid and integral development more effectively than many secular agencies. Furthermore, religious belief and practice continue to provide grounds for meaning-making, resistance and resilience to many with limited economic or political resources. In all these ways, religion is far from museum status, and it continues to exist, to thrive, to evolve as a complex, multi-layered and dynamic reality in our contemporary world. It is far more interesting a picture than the secularization thesis would have led us to imagine. Many of us have also been raised on some form or version of the philosophy of liberalism that suggested that the language of virtue, particularly the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love, was a legitimate matter of private belief, but had no place in the neutral, secular public world. The acquired virtues, however, including justice and prudence, remained relevant, but became more agreeable when detached from their infused theological virtues. Liberal politicians have used a language of secular hope shorn of its theological foundations in a way that has become closer to simple optimism. This form of political hope as optimism has not endured well and has been supplanted by a politics of anger and resentment. Thus, here we stand in early 2025, at a moment when religion has defied secularization theorists and politics has defied the philosophers of liberalism. And the language of virtue, encompassing faith, hope, and love, is resurgent, although it is as contested and as irascible as ever. Significantly, this resurgence in the political claims to virtue on all sides of the political arena occurs just at a moment when people report struggling most with feelings of social hopelessness. The hunger for hope and the absence of hope are critical indicators of our moment's health. As a small illustration, social science researchers have, to my mind convincingly, charted that having some sense of hope for the future correlates with your engagement with civil society, your willingness to vote, and even your health. Correspondingly, those who are vulnerable to feelings of social despair are much more susceptible to misinformation and conspiracy theories. Hope and trust, it turns out, are deeply related. Hope is connected to social trust, to participation in all aspects of social life, and a sense of connection to near and, yes, distant neighbours. For all of these reasons, Pope Francis's dedication of this year to hope is especially timely. In the short time this evening, I would like to respond to this current context that I've tried to set out a little, which I see as marked by both the politicisation of virtue and the hunger for some real, genuine kind of hope, by highlighting several features of a specifically Christian theological account of hope. In what follows, I will highlight 3 themes that are central to Pope Francis's decree for this Jubilee year. Firstly, that hope is to be understood first and foremost as a gift, rather than something that we ourselves originate. Secondly, hope is for Christians a habitual practice, a way of doing and a way of being. It is not merely a sentiment or a feeling. And finally, that maintaining the habit of hope is connected to our capacity to discern what Pope Francis calls the signs of hope as part of our Christian duty to read the signs of the times. To return for a moment to the very source J.D. Vance was so keen we air, St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas treats hope at some length, and what he has to say is, I think, very timely and helpful to us. It's also the grounds on which modern Catholic social teaching on hope, including the writings of Pope Francis, stand. For Aquinas, hope is not a cognitive decision or expectation, but rather a desire or an appetite that all humans have for the good. Aquinas considers hope, and I find this very attractive, Aquinas considers hope to be an appropriately selfish virtue. Hope is for ourselves, and it is for others who share our human condition. While love is the truly benevolent virtue because it desires good without expecting anything in return or counting the cost, hope remains the appropriately selfish virtue. I need it, you need it, it's for me and it's for us. It speaks to what we ourselves need in order to persevere. It's the deeply rooted desire in every human soul that throughout our lives, good and not harm will come to us. And that even if the pathway is rough, we can strive towards some form of real fulfillment for ourselves and for others. Aquinas describes hope as not only an appropriately selfish, but also an irascible passion, because it represents a desire for a worthy good that is still very difficult to attain. It's both worthy and extremely difficult to attain. If the good longed for were easy to achieve, it would not require hope. If it was something we could accomplish effortlessly and without God's assistance, it would not be hope. Hope takes us through a path of difficulty, of struggle, of loss, of failure, and sometimes even of suffering. Yet it remains hope because, although it is difficult to attain, it is still possible to attain. We see injustice, but no, it is not invincible, as Laudato Si states. This represents the crucial tension within a Christian understanding of hope, the difficulty and the possibility of reaching what is truly good for us. Here, recognizing hope as part of our pursuit of the good, albeit arduous, it is essential to comprehend what makes hope possible from a Christian perspective. What makes hope possible in the tradition is not a belief in human progress or the assumption that things will resolve in the end if we just relax and let things unfold. Indeed, Aquinas refers to such assumptions as the enemy of true hope. What makes the good things we rightly hope for possible is that hope is not something initially generated by you and I, by human beings. Rather, hope is a divine gift infused in us. In a sense, this should provide some relief for us this evening in a world where creating feelings of hope on our own can seem near impossible. We receive hope as a gift, but importantly, we are responsible to act upon that gift. In more biblical terms, hope is an acceptance of and trust in a promise of a reality that sustains and transforms our reality. That acceptance and trust in a promise enables us, in the midst of horror and adversity, to enact the signs and the logic of hope. To illustrate this very briefly, 5 years ago, I conducted a series of interviews with refugees living in asylum destitution in London. For protracted periods of up to a decade, those I interviewed had been living without formal immigration status and without a recourse to a right to work or welfare support. They existed on little else other than charitable assistance and a network of other refugees. In talking to them about religion's role in their stories and their journeys, the same passage, rather remarkably, was quoted repeatedly to me. Jeremiah 29. I have a plan for your welfare and not for your harm, for a future with hope, they told me. I was told God has a plan for me, for my welfare and not my harm. If I've not yet reached that place where the plan is clear to me, it is because my story is not yet complete, to quote one man. I have hope because there is a promise that no powers of this world can completely destroy, and because I can tell myself a story which creates a connection between my past, my present, and my future. Talking about these interviews at a conference, I was approached afterwards by 2 prison chaplains who told me of the power of the same Jeremiah narrative for those experiencing imprisonment. It was striking to me to sit with people living hand to mouth, without status, and experiencing the extreme brutality that the modern nation state is capable of, and to be told by them that hope remained a meaningful construct. In fact, the difficulty of their experience intensified, not diminished, hope's meaning. Hope was intensified ultimately because for them it was first and foremost a sustaining theological category. It was a category of God's action that invites from us in return a certain kind of response. 3 things interested me about the hope articulated by those I interviewed, each of which interestingly resonates for me with the classic Christian teaching on hope in Aquinas. As the philosopher Joseph Pieper notes, hope is not the comfortable certainty of possession, but it is necessary because we are creatures who live in time. We live in the agonizing not yet of history. We desire a complete welfare that is not yet fully known or reachable. Hope becomes a more intensely invoked and needed virtue precisely when the gap between the risk of nothingness and destruction and the promise made to us in the covenants of Old and New Testaments seems increased. The more the gap, the more the need for hope. Hope is the entirely appropriate response to the condition of being aware of that gap and living a life that we understand to be on the way, in via, on pilgrimage. Hope is the virtue that places us back in time, not evading, but engaging the sheer difficulty of the world and the sheer gift of the world. Hope sustains our solidarities and struggles for justice and peace. Hope is precisely then the virtue most, rather than least, appropriate for dark times, and when understood in this way, is so clearly not ever to be conflated with optimism, which dismisses or looks away from the gap, or presumption, on the other hand, which refuses to engage with the agony and the difficulty of the gap, leaving it to somebody else. Hope is for us, and it is the virtue appropriate for the condition of living in the gap, stretching in the gap towards justice and peace. In St. Paul's listing, hope sits for good reason between faith and love. Faith leads us to recognize our hope. Hope leads us to the practices of love, and love, in turn, to faith and hope. Secondly, those I interviewed clearly stated that hope for them leads to action, to agency. It gives them a sense of their agency in a situation in which they felt dispossessed of their agency. Hope, which is a gift, invites us into active reception and no one can take that away from us. It draws us into the great drama of the cooperation between God and humanity. Hope infused in us, leads us into hope's actions. Again, interestingly, social science discussions of hope also make this connection to agency clear. Those who feel they lack agency in the world, feeling that they don't have the capacity to really act in their lives, often report being the most hopeless, while those with a sense that they do have agency maintain more hope, even under difficult and trying circumstances. Thus, we seem to share a natural understanding of what Aquinas alludes to. For Aquinas, it is a question of both what we hope in and what we hope for. The Christian perspective on hope, then, is far less a matter of feeling hopeful and much more about centering ourselves in hope's actions, contemplating how hope moves through us in Christ for a broken world. Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti outline the practices of hope that we're called to. Theologically, hope arises from a trust that we can always change our direction, that crises that happen in the world can deepen our recognition of our dependence on God and each other, that, as Pope Francis endlessly reminds us, no one is saved alone. They also call us to political actions of hope, learning to redistribute power, wealth, status, prioritising the needs of the poorest, localising power while globalising compassion. Thirdly, since hope allows us to confront the gap between the violence and injustice of the world and our desire deep within every single one of us in our souls for welfare and fulfilment, it follows that hope and fear are never opposites. This reality was evident to those I interviewed. It's also central to Aquinas' account. We live in a time of anxiety, exacerbated, I would argue, by the toxicity of social media. So it's very important for me to clarify that anxiety and fear are not synonymous. They're not the same thing. The theological tradition distinguishes between anxiety, which paralyzes the soul, which escalates and prevents us from engaging with reality, and fear, which can be holy and righteous and a motivator for us to act for the good. I fear not being a good parent, or a good spouse, or a good teacher, or a decent citizen. And that fear should motivate me daily to engage with my students, or my children, or my partner, or my membership of society to strive for excellence in those roles. I fear that the world will succumb to futile conflicts and stray from its true desire for peace, and that the earth's resources will not reach those for whom they were intended by God due to greed or corruption. My fear of these things turns me towards the hope that arises from the promises of God and towards action. It does not paralyze me. Hope, then, is the virtue suited to the risk that things may not turn out well, serving as the antidote to either despair or simplistic optimism in the light of the fact that everything is not well. In his beautiful letter on hope, Spe Salvi, Pope Benedict attempted to encapsulate the essence of Christian hope by, in typical Pope Benedict fashion, explaining what hope is as much as what hope is not. He stated that hope is not the promise or expectation of feelings of private personal satisfaction and happiness that simply endure over time. It is never individualistic, for me, but separated from you. It is not the belief that human societies inevitably progress over time. It is not freedom in this life from all suffering or dependency. Instead, hope, Benedict says, is received, not achieved. We actively adopt hope as a gift, or we refuse it. We have free will to choose or reject participation in hope's ways. Hope is an invitation to a certain kind of habitual action or practice. And hope, he says, is always social, communal, and personal. And it's sustained by three settings: prayer and worship, common action, and the judgment and enacting of justice. In writing a crescendo summary of the virtue tradition on hope that we have explored this evening, Joseph Pieper states, to quote him, "Human hope is directed towards an ultimate and perfect satisfaction of desire. What we truly long for is, as Ernst Bloch quite accurately states, and I love this list, fullness of life, the restoration or healing of man, a homeland, coming home, a kingdom, Jerusalem, the absolute satisfaction of all our needs, and beatitude of a kind we have never known before," end of quote. This is one reason Pope Francis has repeatedly told us that it is virtuous to dream. We have to entertain the vision of a better world in hope, so that our habits and our actions can be formed towards that end. To this tradition of thinking about hope, Pope Francis adds a further dimension in his Jubilee writings, suggesting that part of being signs of hope to others is discerning together in community the signs of hope as part of reading the signs of the times. I think this is actually a far trickier and more countercultural ask than we might realise. We are saturated daily with news that makes us feel despair, leaving us with a Hobson's choice of ignoring it in order to restore some mental balance, or engaging with it, but also knowing that the very thing we engage with is a distorted mirror of a wider reality that is so difficult to capture and to comprehend. The philosopher Hannah Arendt says that we come to know the darkness of the times only by the light cast by those lives that give witness to some alternative path. Lives well lived illuminate. The light interprets the dark, enabling us to know it is darkness. And I think Pope Francis shares this insight. A distinctive part of his message over the last 12 years has been to insist that a Catholic belief in the goodness of the created order and the operation of graced goodness in time means that we are called to actively discern the signs of goodness around us. In Fratelli Tutti, he wrote, to quote him, "Good politics combines love with hope and with confidence in the reserves of goodness present in human hearts," end of quote. We're very familiar with Pope Francis's diagnosis of the things that are wrong in our time: the uprootedness of culture, indifference to poverty and suffering, massified, conflictual and commodified cultures. What is less commented upon, but persistently present in his writings, is this constructive call to train our attention on the seeds of goodness, on the signs of the kingdom of God and God's action through God's creatures to redeem and heal, to sustain and to reconcile. Put another way, the habits and practices of hope will be known and visible in their fruits, and we are called not only to social practices of hope, solidarity, justice seeking, a better distribution of goods, care for our planet, but also to discern them together and to celebrate them. This distinctively Christian tradition of reflection on hope challenges one final feature of social despair. We can tell ourselves that our efforts, however well-meaning, are in vain. We can tell ourselves that our efforts will not necessarily bear fruit and will look foolish in the eyes of the world. We do not yet see all the fruits we would long for, it is true. But a final word from Joseph Pieper helps us reinterpret those sentiments in a Christian register. He argues that every single attempt to act in faith, in hope and love, they do not merely keep us going for now, lost or won in the moment. Rather, every act of hope or love in time participates in what is lasting and eternal. He writes, to quote him, "Nothing good, true, or beautiful is ever lost. Rather, it is folded into eternity. Apocalyptic prophecy tells us, in the words of von Balthasar, that the world will be harvested and the harvest brought home. A politics of hope acts now, in the gap, based on the promise that is inalienably ours and our neighbours, acting both for time and eternity." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Rowlands. So now we're going to open for a question and answer. I'm going to ask Jane Mellett, our church manager, to join Anna here on the platform. And we will, for those of you online, please put your questions into the Q&A and people will bring them up to me and I will ask the question on our behalf. For those of you in the room, we have some roving mics, so we'll open the floor in a minute and we'll ask you to put your hand up to ask Anna or Jane from Trócaire any questions that you may have. So I shall open it to the floor. Does anybody want to start? Please. So we'll just wait till we get you a microphone. Just coming up behind you now. Yep, no, it's coming behind you now. Roisin is bringing it up.
Okay, thanks. So, Brendan Lee, Bishop of Limerick. Thanks very much, Anna, for a wonderful lecture. Just, I suppose, it's a question we all have. How today do we ignite the spark of faith in people? And likewise, how do you think it's best, how best can we engender hope in people? That would be something I'd love to hear what your views are on that.
So I'll start with the second one. I exist in a world where lots of the people I know are involved in huge amounts of social action and social activism, which I accept is not, in fact, in a sense, the majority of the population. But in that community in particular, if you feel like you have to generate hope from within yourself and things are really difficult, that is impossible to sustain in the long run, in my experience, and you end up with all sorts of burnout and fatigue from the attempt to hold the weight of the world on your shoulders and feel responsible for it. So in a sense, I think we have to enable people to understand that theological point that hope is received. And that, you know, the notion that hope is a gift is not a sentimental idea. It's fundamental to the gift of faith, And that, in a sense, is how I would come back round to your first question, is we need to create an encounter in such a way that people receive faith as a gift and to facilitate the conditions for that. A huge amount of that, I think, is actually particularly given where the church is in all sorts of other ways, about learning how to draw close to people, learning how to accompany people in their lives with an openness and an interest and a capacity to listen to the basic questions people have about how to live a life that is good and true and worthy and has some genuine purpose to it. And I think the challenge of doing that in different generational groups is different, frankly. I work with an awful lot of young people who tell me that they feel that the world has these enormous expectations that rest on their shoulders, and yet they're given very little meaningful guidance about how to live lives in that space in a way that they feel they can connect with. Equally, I'm very aware, I'm in my very late 40s, I'm aware of the kind of reality that many of my own generation are living with in terms of their own questions about relationships to complex institutions and so forth. So I think the questions are actually can be quite generationally different, but enabling people to understand that faith is a gift, I think, is fundamental.
Does anybody else have a question? Yes. Just wait till we get you a mic.
Hi, John McGeady, Social Justice Ireland. Thank you very much for an excellent lecture. I'm just wondering, thinking on the theologian Walter Brueggemann, he talks about memory as generative. And if you have any thoughts about, the connection between having a generative memory or a communal memory that we're able to go back to when things are not always thus, and maybe how that connects with the sort of the suppose on the opposite end, then the sort of populist empty promise of going back to a time when everything was perfect, when of course no such time ever existed. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good and interesting question, which we could probably spend about an hour talking about by itself, but we don't have that. So I think one of the things that, Brueggemann certainly talks about memory, and he's doing that in a very particular kind of biblical and ethical register. One of the things about Pope Francis is that he talks about memory quite a lot as well, and in quite an interesting way. So one of the things that he argues, particularly in Fratelli Tutti, is that in order to have hope, you have to have memory. And that one of the things that's really important is communities that exist territorially, rooted communities he talks about a lot. And what rooted communities do is they preserve memory so that people are able to inhabit some relationship between their past, their present, and their future. And when you lose that capacity to live within narratives, within a kind of mythos, then you lose something so fundamental to your sense of being rooted people who are capable of looking to the future. So he talks a lot about that category of memory as fundamental to hope, but also that there are very particular situations where being held within a context of memory we know is hugely important. Think about the reality of having members of your family with dementia. Think about the ways in which we rely upon living within small and large-scale communities that can hold the memory of sometimes literally who we have been as much as who we are as a people. And I think, again, Fratelli Tutti is really interesting on the significance of thinking about good ways of thinking about being a people. And that, I suppose, connects to your kind of the empty promises of populism. And Pope Francis is, and I think Fratelli Tutti came out in a moment during the pandemic when it sort of wasn't really received. And I think now is the moment to read Fratelli Tutti again, because it speaks of all of these realities. And in that, Pope Francis talks about the empty promises of a populism that fails to be rooted for its people and to recognise the importance of community, of rootedness, of meaningful work, of ability to own land and housing, and to recognise all of those core things, but to recognise you will never get to stable, flourishing communities of that kind if you are inward looking, if you see that security is achieved through mistrust and a sense of insecurity and competition with your neighbour. So you could read the reality we are living through right now in terms of global politics of war and peace, of tariffs and economic exchanges. If you just read that section of Fratelli Tutti, it gives you a lens through which to think about productive and fruitful ways of thinking about being a people, which is a deeply theological category for the Church. Vatican II is steeped in the notion of a theology of a people, being a people. To read that as an encouragement to accept the stimulus of what people are longing for, who turn towards populism, but in a sense to feed and nourish the deep roots of that, rather than, in a sense, to manipulate it and to feed off it. And I think the danger is that empty populism feeds off those desires rather than actually feeding them and nourishing them at the root. And that's just a good Augustinian point about learning how desires for the good go awry.
Thank you. Could we have a microphone up here for Tobias to ask a question? And just while we're waiting for that microphone to come up, I'll just, a very quick one is, came online, is what is the sacrament of hope?
I mean, is there a single sacrament of hope? Well, I'm not a sacramental theologian, but I would argue, I'm somebody who's a sacramental theologian can correct me, but if they're literally meaning what is the sacrament of hope, each of the sacraments it forms us for the life of hope and sustains us in a different way. Baptism is our, membership of the people of God and our entry point to this narrative. The Eucharist feeds and nourishes us in that vision of hope. What's the prayer of hope? The Our Father. I can't think of a prayer which is more the prayer of hope than the Our Father.
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much. Tobias.
Thank you, Anna. That was very wonderful and really caused a lot of thoughts trying to make connections with other things. And your reference to the virtue of hope reminded me of another virtue, very important for Pope Francis, mercy. And I'm wondering about some possible connections there that could be kind of played out, teased out. The already not yet reminded me of Jim Keenan's definition of mercy as entering into the chaos of another, entering into that gap, but not in a way that's paternalistic, but in a way that instills hope and fosters partnerships, the agency. So it just reminded me of also work Megan Clark has done, Paul Farmer's Partners in Health, and these kinds of they're examples where hope and mercy, I think, are related. And I was wondering what you might think about that.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it stands as a comment and a contribution on its own. So thank you for that, and that's hugely fertile. What comes to mind, in fact, I'm wondering if I'm going to get told off by a publisher for saying this, but I'm currently reviewing the manuscript of Rowan Williams' next book, which is on solidarity, based on a series of lectures he's given from 2006 till now. And he talks in the section that I was reading on the plane yesterday, interestingly, about critics of the idea of solidarity. And you think, well, why would somebody be critical of the idea of solidarity? I mean, that seems sort of ludicrous unless they're sort of just radical individualists. And he's talking about the work of a particular philosopher who argues that the danger of reading solidarity one way is that it can take us away from the fundamental need for human cooperation. And that what a good reading of the Christian tradition does is places us back in fundamentally cooperative relationships with each other, enabling cooperative relationships. And the danger of a thin version of solidarity is, gosh, that's really awful that happened to you, and I am so with you, and I feel your pain. A thick version of that draws us into co-creative participation in a collective reality and into active practices of cooperation. And I think there's something about mercy read the right way, the way that you're describing, which is enabling. It kind of enables people to draw up, as it were, through experiencing what mercy is. And to be drawn back into instead of the fragmentation and isolation. We know that's what poverty is. We know that that's what sin is. It fragments and isolates us. And what mercy does is it repairs us. It brings us back into a relationship, I think, of co-creative possibility, drawing people back to the fullness of their kind of created nature. So I do see that mercy and hope certainly have that co-belonging. And just because I was reading that yesterday, I've just really been thinking about the necessity of thinking about cooperative, not strategically cooperative, but deeply, co-creative, participatory realities.
Yes, we have a hand up. There, and there.
Julianne Warren from the Synod Pathway. Anna, thank you for that. It was just wonderful to hear you speaking on the virtue of hope. I just loved that you called it a selfish virtue, because I often think too that we need to remember that hope is something we need even in times of abundance or joy, or when we feel fulfilled, that already and not yet means we still need hope. I wonder, might you say something on hope from that perspective, rather than the way we sometimes just associate it with times of despair and suffering?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting thought. It's one of the reasons why I was trying to emphasise that thinking about hope involves us thinking about celebration, recognition. That there's something inherently joyful about thinking about hope, and it kind of connects us to that. I'm trying to think what. I suppose because I spend so much of my time thinking about quite difficult. I've been working on migration and refugee issues for about 15 years. And so, very often you're in a place where you're dealing with people in situations of very, very deep trauma. And so it's the accountability point is thinking about how on earth could you speak about hope in those situations. So I suppose I've spent so long thinking about those that actually thinking about situations of abundance is a kind of slightly different spin on it. I suppose, in one sense, one of the things that the Synod itself was trying to do, and this is where I myself as a theologian felt most kind of passionate in the work about the Synod, is the belief that abundance is the life of the Spirit. So what gives me hope ecclesially is the belief that the Spirit pours out in every age with abundance, not with austerity, the gifts and charisms of the Spirit, and the poverty is ours if we're not kind of discerning that. So I suppose my sense of the life of abundance is really about the activity of God in history and our capacity to be hopeful, because we're attached to that, not just the promise of abundance, but the reality of it, as it were, in time, and our capacity to be sort of open to that, which, you know, again, much of the synodal pathway was also about celebrating at key points. So intervals along the way were to stop and to celebrate. And probably we do need more of that willingness to celebrate as well as to lament.
Thank you. And then, yeah, please go first. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Fonzie Cullen, Bishop Waterford and Lismore. Professor, thank you. That was really beautiful. I too love reading Joseph Pieper. You very rightly critiqued J.D. Vance and his very faulty theology. But, you know, in this part of the world, I think it's also true that, you know, the hope that's being offered to us by our political and social leaders is really hope in economic progress, hope in rising standards of living, hope in technological progress, et cetera, et cetera. So really the hope that's being presented to us is also it's a human construct, really. And as God is being pushed out of the public square, hope is equally a very narrow and faulty concept. If you could just, you know, say a word about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. In a sense, that's one of the reasons why I was trying to so clearly distinguish optimism from hope. Because I think the danger is, and I would say this because I'm a Christian theologian, but once you take the theological foundation out, the danger is that or the temptation at very least, is that you end up offering a thin version of those hopes. One of the things I didn't have time to talk about tonight that is probably relevant to mention in light of your question is that the theological tradition distinguishes between hopes in the plural and hope. So we can legitimately have hopes in the plural. I hope it won't rain tonight. I hope my plane will not be delayed tomorrow. I hope, I didn't go on for 15 minutes too long tonight. You know, there are specific, and also that can be, not to be flippant, that can be genuine hopes that I have a warm home that I can inhabit, that I don't have to feel insecure or anxious about. And the theological tradition says it's reasonable to have those hopes. And I actually think that some of the things that and I don't want to sort of just pick out J.D. Vance as in that way, but the kind of current post-liberal populism appeals to people's genuine hopes in the plural, which are not unreasonable hopes to have. When you talk to people about what they deeply desire, they want stable families, they want a decent home that they don't need to feel insecure about, they want some basic leisure time that they can spend with people they love and care about, and they want meaningful, dignified work that they can take some pride in. So those are not unrealistic hopes. The question is, what's the political project around that, and what narrative does it give? What narrative does it give us about what politics is for and who it's for? And really importantly, from a Christian perspective, and I think this is the really underplayed bit that we need to get at carefully in public debate, it's about power and what power is for. And if the theological tradition has anything to say ethically to politics, it should surely to God be about what power is and how it should be exercised. And you might find yourself, especially as bishops, in agreement with this policy but not that one. So then how do you take a stance? But there's a bigger picture there about the nature of power and its exercise. And again, Fratelli Tutti talks really beautifully and powerfully about power not used as force, power not used as domination. And the details of your policies are almost less significant than the framework of the exercise and intention of power in its use. You know, I'm in a country where I hardly need to make that point. So that it concerns me that, yes, we have to have a language for talking about those realistic hopes in the plural and the failure of other political programmes to speak to those meaningfully. But then we also have to have a proper account of hope. And that includes questions of justice, of power, and so forth.
Thank you very much.
Up the front here, our kind volunteer. And then we have, no, sorry, next one and then one. I think that's all we will have time for. Okay, we'll try and take a couple more. I've just been told we want to get you out in time, but we'll maybe go on for another 5 minutes.
I hope I'm not the last questioner. Anna, thank you very much. My name is Tony. I'm unaffiliated really, although I do volunteer with Trócaire. This question is really for both of you. I was in a drug treatment centre last night for a meeting, actually. But there was something written on the wall which said, you alone can do it, but you cannot do it alone. One of those little inspiring quotes. And in these really troubled times, I think, and I'm thinking about Trócaire and its efforts and now the challenges it has given the withdrawal of US aid. But I'm also thinking about what you very profoundly said about hope, that if I paraphrase you a small bit, it's a gift, but it's a gift that's there to be used. It's a gift which becomes active, and your hope is enacted in your work for love and for justice in the world and with our community and with our fellow human beings. So my question really is, how, as a Christian community, or even a community with a religious sense, can we make that transition from seeing faith and acting in faith as privatized, maybe personal and passive, to something which is communal and intensely active? Because for sure, the other side is very active just at the moment.
Thanks, Tony. Just to speak to a little bit about the work we're involved in and your question, a lot of our work is turning or has turned towards the Data Sea and climate justice. And that is a space where there is a lot of despair, there is a lot of fatigue, particularly amongst people who are very active in advocacy and so on and so forth. And there's fear and there's a desperate need for hope. And I think, you know, how do we cultivate that hope in that setting? I think we need to just remember that this hope is a gift, but it needs to be brought about. So it's not just your Asher, it'll be grand. This is a hope that comes through action. And to quote Greta Thunberg, it's a favourite quote of mine, but she says, what we need more than hope is action. Then and only then the hope will come. It's through the gathering and the action that is made manifest. And I think it's really important to remember that. We had an event a few weeks ago with former Minister Eamon Ryan, who's here this evening, and we were over in the Lumen Institute, and this whole question came up again amongst people who were deeply passionate about La Data Sea and deeply concerned about the whole issue on climate and the environment. And it was noted that, you know, the tide is out right now in terms of the climate movement, pardon the pun, but it will come back in again. And when it does, we all need to be ready for that and to ride that wave. But in the meantime, we need to come together and have these conversations, and not to forget our power in those conversations, and not to be afraid to come together and have the difficult conversations. Because the other side, as to quote you, they're gathering and having conversations, and the rhetoric that's out there is extremely fearful at the moment. So there is an element of not being afraid to come together in faith, have difficult conversations, and to start somewhere. And that is where hope is cultivated and made manifest. And I think it's so important to be empowered to do that today, and to see what emerges. And I think that's the work we're called into right now, for sure.
So perhaps I'll deal with the other bit of your question about the privatisation of or privatised responses. So this really intrigues me, and it's just totally evident to me that when you read the Gospels, a privatised response is just not a legitimate way of thinking about what Christian faith is. So that means something has happened to our psyches, particularly as modern liberals, that means that we have entered into a space in which our sense of faith has become privatised. And I think there's a number of different dimensions to that, one of which is simply strongly cultural, that we are all liberals, as Stanley Hauerwas would say. Even if you think you're not, you are, because it's the air you breathe and it's the way that we have been brought up. And so you have to kind of consciously become aware of what is unconscious in your own kind of cultural, even in a more kind of communitarian society, that is still there. But then I also think that, I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to clergy who, when I ask them, so is this, is Catholic social teaching, is this vision of the gospel something that enters into your preaching? Is it something that's part of the programs you run in your parish, etc.? They will often say to me that what stops them from engaging in that way is a lack of confidence. In some regards, and a kind of fearfulness about their own competence in that space, the risk of entering into that space. So there's a degree of kind of apprehension and fear that keeps some from leading, as it were, in those positions. And I think sometimes that also comes from a kind of genuine sense of being overwhelmed by much of what we face. And I don't think we can underestimate the extent to which people feel simply overwhelmed. I also think that enabling people to feel responsible in a manageable way, so that they are able to connect with the realities of their neighbours and the bigger picture. That's a whole existential, spiritual thing to help people feel those connections. And the other thing is, we have privatised people's pain and suffering in quite impressive ways. So to give one instance, I remember talking to somebody when everybody was doing refugee welcome marches in the UK, and someone said to me, somebody who I know very well, who had lost her home, had extreme difficulties with her children, her marriage was in a terrible state, and she said to me, who marched for me? Who showed me solidarity when I lost everything? And to her, these were sort of middle-class do-gooders who were terribly concerned about something happening far away, but she felt she had borne in huge privacy the agony of her own suffering, and nobody had shared that with her. So I think the degree of private pain and loneliness that people feel is less easy to break out of than we might think. So there's a real question about how we build solidaristic cultures and communities such that we are able to share each other's burdens and truly understand that none of us are saved alone and we're really responsible for all. So that I think it's a really complex, multi-layered reality underneath the question you've asked. I don't have a simplistic solution for that.
Thank you. We had a couple of hands up with it. Bishop Allen.
Oh, sorry. Good, thank you. Alan Guggian, Bishop of Durham Connor. Thank you, Anna. I really enjoyed that, and I look forward to reading it at greater length. When I think of hope in this really troubling world, I can imagine living hope in relation to the marginalised, to the however we understand them. What does hope and my living of hope look like in relation to people on the other side of the ideological divide? You know, with a fratelli tutti sense of the word.
Which ideological divide?
Well, I'm thinking, well, we started off talking about J.D. Vance tonight. Just the people who are promoting another agenda entirely for our world, and who are doing it from within the Catholic world.
Yeah. So I would make a distinction between those who are who feel strongly in support of an ideological political project that I myself would not support, but who are motivated to do so by, as I was saying before, genuine hopes and aspirations that they believe, I think falsely, will be delivered by these particular regimes. And I think it's not difficult, in fact, to understand why somebody in my setting would vote for Brexit that I did not, or why somebody in the US might vote for Trump when personally I would not, because I do think that the distortedness of our political systems has fed the desperate desire of people for some kind of sense of liberation and salvation in their lives. And it's really interesting to me to learn. I realise that Tobias and Josh and others are here this evening who can speak more directly and with more integrity and authority about the American experience, but having read some work by American sociologists interviewing people who have voted for Trump, they use theological language to describe why they have voted for Trump. He is for them a figure of liberation from a sense of shame, liberation from a sense of kind of hopelessness and worthwhilelessness. I don't think that's a word. But we have to understand, and I mean by we, somebody who isn't in the position of wanting to vote for somebody of that particular persuasion, we have to understand why people feel that way. And again, my view would be an Augustinian one, which is you understand a desire gone astray. And at the root of much of this, there are legitimate political desires. Not that every desire is legitimate that has led somebody to vote for that position. There are things that I simply would object to in somebody else's worldview. But I think a good Augustinian orientation to understanding the deep-seated nature of the goods that we long for, which applies as much to thinking about why a migrant crosses a border in search of basic goods that all human beings are orientated and wired to seek. In the same way, there are reasons why people vote ideologically for, I think, movements that will lead them deeply astray. I would have a different perspective on how one does dialogue with someone who I think is an active manipulator of those hopes and will fail to deliver on them, because that is a more challenging and a different kind of conversation.
I'm terribly sorry, but we are going to have to call it a night. Professor Anna is going to join us, for those of you who are present, in a little reception afterwards, so we'll invite you in there and she'll be open to ask any questions. Unfortunately, we've just run out of time. It's been too interesting. Thank you. So I'm just going to say a few thank yous. So as we come to the end of this very thought-provoking lecture, we're reminded that hope is not simply a feeling, but a practice, a habit, and most importantly, a gift. Tonight's discussion has reinforced that hope is found in action. By working within our own circles of influence, we contribute to a broader change. Even small acts of justice, kindness, and solidarity can ripple outwards in ways we can never truly see. So as we all leave here tonight, let's carry this message forward, not just in words, but in action. May we be the light that interprets the darkness, the witness to an alternative path, and the bearers of hope in our communities and beyond. Thank you so much, Professor Rowlands, for your wonderful talk tonight. To St. Patrick's College for hosting this really important discussion and their ongoing support and collaboration with Trócaire. Thank you to Kairos Communications, who provided the sound and online facilitation for this evening. The lecture has been recorded and will be shared on Trócaire and YouTube afterwards. Thank you to all the staff and volunteers from St. Patrick's College and Trócaire present here tonight, and those involved in the setup. Particular thanks to the Bishop Conference for your ongoing and continued support. We really appreciate your presence here tonight. And for all of you who are present and who are watching online, thank you for your engagement and for your encouragement. Take care, and may hope continue to guide us all. As I said, for those of you who are present, I'll ask you to join us in Pugin Hall for a reception. Thank you very much.